"Where did you get that?" Diana Sterling whispered at 6:47 p.m. on a Thursday evening as she stood frozen in the doorway of her executive office at Sterling Financial, staring at the battered metal lunchbox that the black elderly janitor was placing on his cleaning cart, a vintage military-issue container from the late 1960s, dented and rusted, but meticulously maintained with 3 initials barely visible through decades of wear. J.R.S. At 68, Raymond Ray Johnson possessed the kind of careful dignity that characterized Vietnam veterans whose service had been both defining experience and permanent wound. His movements still carried military precision, despite arthritis that made pushing cleaning carts painful. His eyes still scanned rooms for threats that hadn't existed for 50 years. And his hands still trembled slightly when anyone noticed the lunchbox that had been his constant companion since March 14, 1971. The day his best friend had died in his arms, asking him to make a promise that Ray had spent 47 years trying to keep. "Ma'am, this lunchbox belonged to someone I served with in Vietnam," Ray replied quietly, his voice carrying the controlled emotion that veterans learned for discussing memories that remained vivid, despite nearly 5 decades of trying to forget the jungle, the blood, the screaming, and the friend who had trusted him with final words that Ray had been unable to deliver until 6 months ago, when he had finally located the daughter that Lieutenant James Sterling had never gotten to meet. At 43, Diana Sterling possessed the kind of controlled authority that characterized self-made CEOs who had built billion-dollar financial empires through intelligence and determination, though the trembling in her hands as she approached the lunchbox suggested that she was processing recognition that transcended professional composure. Those initials, J.R.S., matched the only tangible memory she had of her father, a faded photograph her mother had kept before remarrying and systematically erasing James Robert Sterling from family history in favor of the stepfather who had saved them from poverty. "Those initials," Diana said, her voice barely audible as she pointed at the worn metal. "My father's name was James Robert Sterling. He died in Vietnam when I was 6 months old. My mother told me that all his personal effects were lost, that we never received anything from the military except notification of his death." "Ma'am, I need to sit down for this conversation," Ray said, his legs suddenly weak with the recognition that 47 years of searching had finally brought him to this moment, not the triumphant reunion he had imagined, but rather the beginning of revelations that would destroy everything Diana believed about her family, her fortune, and the man she had been calling father for 4 decades. The conference room that Ray and Diana moved to was empty. The executive floor cleared at 5 p.m., except for Diana's workaholic schedule and Ray's evening cleaning routine that he had deliberately arranged to coincide with her late hours, creating opportunities for the accidental encounter that he had been engineering since taking this custodial job 6 months ago, specifically to access the woman whose childhood photograph had been tucked in James Sterling's pocket when he died. "Mr. Johnson, please explain how you have my father's lunchbox," Diana said, her CEO authority fracturing as maternal curiosity and grief about the father she had never known overwhelmed professional distance that typically characterized her interactions with service workers. "Ms. Sterling, your father and I served together in the 101st Airborne Division from 1969 to 1971, Ray began, his voice carrying the careful precision that came from rehearsing this conversation in his mind for decades. "Lieutenant James Sterling was my commanding officer, my best friend, and the finest man I ever knew. He saved my life twice. I tried to save his once, but I failed." The statement was both simple and devastating. Ray's guilt about surviving when James had died remained fresh, Despite half a century of processing through VA counseling and veteran support groups that had helped with PTSD, but couldn't eliminate the promise that Ray had made to a dying friend whose daughter had been unreachable for 47 years. "How did my father die?" Diana asked. The question representing curiosity that her mother had never satisfied beyond vague references to combat operations and friendly fire that had made James's death seem like tragic accident rather than deliberate murder that Ray had witnessed but couldn't prove through military investigation that had been systematically buried by the officer who had pulled the trigger. "Your father died on March 14th, 1971, at 16:47 hours in a jungle clearing, approximately 40 kilometers north of Saigon," Ray replied. The specific details making Diana realize that this wasn't rehearsed military notification, but rather first-hand memory of traumatic event that Ray had been unable to forget. "He died in my arms after being shot by his commanding officer during dispute about orders that your father refused to follow, because those orders violated rules of engagement and would have resulted in civilian casualties." The revelation hit Diana like physical violence, not because she immediately understood implications about murder and cover-up, but because Ray's specificity about her father's death contradicted everything her mother and stepfather had told her about tragic accident that had claimed hero father during routine combat operations. "You're saying my father was murdered," Diana whispered, processing information that seemed impossible to reconcile with the medals her mother had framed, and the stories her stepfather Marcus had told about James Sterling's heroic sacrifice during firefight with enemy forces. "Ma'am, I'm saying that your father was shot by Colonel Marcus Webb during confrontation about war crimes that Webb was committing, and that your father threatened to report," Ray replied, watching Diana's face drain of color as she processed the name Marcus Webb, the same name as the stepfather who had raised her, who had built Sterling Financial, who had been the only father figure she had ever known. "Marcus Webb is my stepfather," Diana said, her voice carrying horror about connections that Ray's story was revealing. "He married my mother when I was 3 years old. He's been my father for 40 years. Are you telling me that my father was murdered by the man who raised me?" "Yes, ma'am. That's exactly what I'm telling you," Ray confirmed, "and I can prove it because your father spent the last 40 minutes of his life writing you a letter explaining everything, and he made me promise to deliver that letter, along with evidence about the $2.3 million in death benefits and life insurance that Colonel Webb stole from your family when he falsified records about your father's death." As Ray opened the battered lunchbox with hands that trembled from both age and emotion, Diana watched decades of carefully maintained lies begin to unravel through the contents that her father had entrusted to his best friend with dying request that had taken nearly half a century to fulfill, but which contained truths that would destroy Diana's understanding of her entire life. The first item Ray removed was a sealed envelope, yellowed with age but preserved carefully, with "To my daughter Diana," to be opened on her 18th birthday, written in handwriting that Diana had never seen, but which somehow felt familiar in ways that transcended conscious memory. This was her father's hand, writing words meant for daughter he would never meet, creating connection across death that 47 years hadn't eliminated. "Your father wrote this letter on March 14th, 1971, after he'd been shot but before he died," Ray explained, his voice breaking as he handed Diana the envelope that he had carried for 47 years. "He had about 40 minutes before blood loss became fatal, and he spent that time writing to you instead of trying to get medical help that might have saved him. He chose you over survival." Diana's hands trembled so violently as she accepted the letter that she nearly dropped it, processing that she was holding final words from father she had never known, communication that had been delayed by nearly 5 decades, but which represented paternal love that death couldn't eliminate even when bureaucratic corruption and military cover-ups had prevented delivery. The second item was a photograph, black and white, creased and faded, showing a young soldier in uniform holding an infant with expression of such complete joy and love that Diana's professional composure shattered completely because she recognized the baby in the photo as herself from pictures her mother had kept, but she had never seen this photograph of her father holding her because her mother had claimed all photos had been lost during post-war relocations and trauma. "This was in your father's pocket when he died," Ray said quietly. "He carried your picture into every operation, and it's the last thing he looked at before he closed his eyes. He kept saying, 'Tell Diana I love her. Tell Diana I'm sorry I won't be there. Tell Diana the truth about Webb.'" The third item was a set of military dog tags, tarnished but intact, with sterling James R, stamped into metal that Diana had been told were lost in combat, but which Ray had preserved as evidence that contradicted official military records about how and where James Sterling had died. The fourth item was what would ultimately destroy Diana's understanding of her entire family fortune: documentation showing that Lieutenant James Sterling had been entitled to $2.3 million in combat death benefits, life insurance, and military compensation that had never been paid to his widow and infant daughter because official records had been falsified to indicate that his death resulted from friendly fire during unauthorized operation, eliminating benefits that should have been automatic for soldier killed in legitimate combat. Your father's death benefits were never paid because Colonel Marcus Webb falsified after-action reports claiming that your father died during unauthorized patrol that violated direct orders. Ray explained, his voice carrying controlled fury, about military corruption that had destroyed families while protecting war criminals. Webb claimed that your father's death was a result of his own poor judgment, which eliminated your family's eligibility for the full death benefits. Then Webb stole the money himself through fraudulent claims and used it to start the business ventures that eventually became Sterling Financial. Diana felt the floor seemed to drop away as she processed implications. The company that bore her father's name, the fortune that had funded her education and career, the lifestyle that had made her successful CEO, all of it had been built with money stolen from her father's death by the man who had murdered him and then married his widow to ensure that the theft would never be discovered. Some discoveries about family history reveal that everything we believed about our origins was constructed through lies that protected murderers while erasing victims, and that the people we called father might have killed the men whose names we carry while stealing fortunes that should have been our inheritance. Before we continue with this devastating revelation, I need you to do something. If this story is gripping you, if you're feeling the weight of 47 years compressed into that rusted lunchbox, if you're processing what it means that Diana has been calling her father's murderer Dad for 4 decades, subscribe to this channel right now. We bring you stories that expose the darkest corners of American history: Vietnam War cover-ups, stolen military benefits, and the impossible promises that veterans carry for half a century because honor matters more than convenience. Hit that like button if you're feeling the devastating recognition of those initials on that lunchbox. And comment below, what time is it where you're watching? Where are you from? Have you ever discovered that someone you trusted was lying to you about something fundamental? Do you have family members who served in Vietnam? Have you ever carried a promise for years, waiting for the right moment to fulfill it? The letter that would destroy Diana Sterling's understanding of her entire life had been sealed for 47 years, but as she opened the yellowed envelope with trembling hands at 7:23, p.m. in the empty conference room, while Ray Johnson watched with tears streaming down his weathered face, the words her father had written minutes before dying became as immediate and devastating as if James Sterling was speaking directly to the daughter he had never gotten to raise. "My dearest Diana, if you're reading this, it means Ray kept his promise and found you. And it means I didn't make it home like I kept telling your mother I would. I'm writing this on March 14th, 1971, and I've been shot by Colonel Marcus Webb because I refused to participate in his plan to massacre civilians in a village where he's been running opium trafficking operations using military supply chains. I reported him to command, but he has connections that protect him, and now he's made sure I won't be able to testify. I'm bleeding badly, and Ray says we can't get medical evacuation in time. So I need to use these last minutes to tell you truths that Webb will try to bury along with my body." Diana's voice broke as she read aloud, unable to process her father's words privately when Ray had carried them for 47 years and deserved to hear them spoken after decades of protecting this final testimony. "Baby girl, you're only 6 months old right now and you'll never remember me, but I need you to know that every minute I've been in this jungle, I've been thinking about getting home to you and your mother. I'm sorry I won't be there for your first words, your first steps, your first day of school, your graduation, your wedding, or any of the moments that fathers are supposed to witness. I'm sorry that you'll grow up without me, and that some other man will get to be called Daddy by the little girl who should have been mine to raise." The grief in James's words was both immediate and timeless. A young father processing in real time that he would never know his daughter, creating testament of love that death was about to make permanent. "Diana, I need you to know that you're entitled to $2, $3 million in military death benefits, life insurance, and combat compensation that should be paid to your mother within 90 days of my death. That money should ensure you never suffer from poverty and that your mother can provide everything you need for a good life. Don't let anyone tell you that you're not entitled to that money. It's yours by right, purchased with my blood, and it should take care of you and your mother for the rest of your lives." Diana felt her stomach turn as she processed that the money her father had tried to secure for her family had been stolen by the man who had murdered him, and that every dollar of the sterling financial fortune had originally been intended to support the widow and daughter of the man whose death had funded the empire. "But Diana, I need to warn you about something that terrifies me more than dying. Colonel Marcus Webb is a dangerous man who will do anything to protect his crimes. If you're reading this years from now, it means he survived the war and might try to contact your mother. If Webb ever approaches your family, you need to know that he murdered me to silence testimony about war crimes, including civilian massacres and drug trafficking. Don't trust him, don't accept his help, don't let him anywhere near your mother or you. He killed me to protect his secrets, and he won't hesitate to hurt you if you threaten to expose what he's done." The warning was both prophetic and devastating. James had tried to protect his daughter from the man who would ultimately raise her, and his desperate final words had been delayed for 47 years, while Marcus Webb had done exactly what James had feared by pursuing Patricia and gaining access to the family he had destroyed. "Ray has promised me he'll deliver this letter and expose Webb's crimes, and I trust Ray with my life. Actually, I trust him with your life, which matters more to me than my own. Whatever Ray tells you about my death, believe him. He was there. He tried to save me. He's the best friend I ever had, and if he's managed to find you after all these years, it means he's kept faith with a promise that most people would have abandoned. Trust Ray. He's honorable in ways that this war hasn't destroyed." Diana looked at Ray through tears, processing that the elderly janitor she had barely noticed for 6 months had been carrying this sacred burden for 47 years, maintaining promise to dead friend despite obstacles that would have justified abandoning the mission decades ago. Diana, I'm running out of time and my handwriting is getting harder to control, so I need to finish by telling you the most important thing. I love you more than I've ever loved anything in my life. You're 6 months old, and you don't know me, but you're the reason I tried to be honorable, even when this war made honor seem impossible. Every decision I made here was shaped by knowing that I needed to be the kind of man you could be proud of someday. I hope Ray has told you that I died trying to do the right thing. I hope you understand that refusing Webb's orders cost me my life, but saved civilians who didn't deserve to be slaughtered for a colonel's drug profits. I hope you've had a good life despite growing up without me. I hope your mother found happiness after I was gone. I hope you'll forgive me for not coming home. And I hope you know that you were loved completely by a father you'll never remember. Forever yours, Daddy. Daddy you. The conference room was silent, except for Diana's sobbing and Ray's quiet crying, as they processed that James Sterling's final act had been writing love letter to daughter he would never know, creating connection across death that 47 years hadn't diminished. Mr. Johnson, you carried this letter for 47 years, Diana finally said, her voice breaking. You kept my father's promise when you could have just thrown it away and moved on with your life. Why? Why did you spend nearly 5 decades trying to find me? Ma'am, because I made a promise to my best friend while he was dying, and because your father saved my life twice before he died, saving those civilians that Webb wanted to massacre, Ray replied, his voice carrying conviction that transcended simple duty. James Sterling was the finest man I ever knew, and the least I could do was spend my life trying to keep the promise I made to him. I'm just sorry it took me 47 years to find you. Meanwhile, the revelation about Marcus Webb's role in James's death was creating crisis that extended beyond Diana's personal trauma to include legal questions about Sterling Financial's founding and ownership. If the company had been built with money stolen from James Sterling's death benefits, then Diana's inheritance might actually belong to her through her father, rather than through the stepfather who had murdered him and stolen his fortune. Ms. Sterling, I need to show you additional documentation that Ray provided to my office 3 months ago, said Attorney Lucas Johnson, Ray's son, who had spent the past year investigating military records and financial transactions that connected Marcus Webb's business ventures to the stolen death benefits that should have supported Diana and her mother. The evidence suggests that Sterling Financial was founded in 1974 using $2. $1 million in capital that Marcus Webb claimed came from Vietnam business ventures, but financial forensics show that money entered Webb's accounts in April 1971, exactly 30 days after your father's death, and consistent with timing for military death benefit payouts. The documentation was both technically complex and emotionally devastating. Spreadsheets and bank records showing that Marcus Webb had received exactly the amount that James Sterling's death benefits should have generated, and that those funds had been used to start import-export business that eventually became the financial empire Diana now controlled. Are you telling me that every dollar I've ever earned has been built on my father's stolen death benefits? Diana asked, processing that her success had been funded by the murder of the man whose name she carried, but whose face she had never known. I'm telling you that Sterling Financial exists because Marcus Webb murdered your father and stole the money that should have ensured you never needed to work for anything, Lucas replied with professional directness. Your father died trying to provide for you, and the man who killed him used that provision to build empire that he's allowed you to run while maintaining ultimate control through mechanisms you probably don't even realize exist in your corporate structure. Some moral choices require confronting that everything you've achieved might have been possible only because of crimes against the father you never knew, and that success built on stolen inheritance creates obligations to honor the victim, even when that honor requires destroying the only family structure you've ever known. 4 days after reading her father's 47-year-old letter, Diana Sterling found herself sitting across from her mother, Patricia, at the assisted living facility where the 70-year-old woman had been living since her Alzheimer's diagnosis 2 years ago. A diagnosis that Marcus had insisted required expensive private care, funded by the sterling financial fortune that Diana now understood had been built on her father's stolen death benefits and cold-blooded murder. "Mom, I need to ask you about my father," Diana said at 2:17 p.m. on a Sunday afternoon, her voice carrying controlled emotion as she prepared to confront whether her mother had been victim or accomplice in the conspiracy that had stolen 43 years of truth from the daughter who deserved to know how her father had actually died. At 70, Patricia Sterling Webb possessed the kind of fragmented cognition that characterized Alzheimer's patients, whose memories became unreliable even as certain moments from distant past remained crystalline. She couldn't remember what she'd eaten for breakfast, but she could recall with devastating clarity the day in April 1971 when military notification officers had informed her that Lieutenant James Sterling had died in combat operations, leaving behind a 6-month-old daughter and a widow who was 3 months pregnant with second child. That miscarriage would claim 2 weeks later when grief became too overwhelming for her body to sustain new life. "James," Patricia whispered, her voice suddenly clear as decades-old memory pierced through pharmaceutical fog and neural deterioration. "You want to know about James? Beautiful James who promised he'd come home and never did." "And Mom, did you know Marcus Webb before Daddy died?" Diana asked, using childhood name for the stepfather, whose paternal role she was now questioning while processing that the man she'd called Dad for 40 years might have murdered the father, whose memory had been systematically erased from family history. "Marcus came to the funeral," Patricia replied, her lucidity surprising as traumatic memories proved more accessible than recent events. "He was James's commanding officer. He told me James died a hero, that he'd tried to save him, that James's last words were about how much he loved us. Marcus was so kind during those first months when I couldn't function, when the grief made breathing feel impossible." "Mom, when did Marcus start courting you?" Diana pressed, recognizing that her mother's momentary clarity represented brief window for extracting truths that Alzheimer's was progressively burying beneath neural degeneration. "Too soon," Patricia whispered, her honesty suggesting that even 50 years later she recognized that Marcus's pursuit had been inappropriately rapid for widower respecting his fallen soldier's memory. "He came to check on us every week, brought groceries, paid bills, helped with you when I couldn't get out of bed. By Christmas 1971, he was staying overnight. By your second birthday, he'd moved in. We married when you were 3 because he said you needed a father and I needed someone to help me survive." The timeline was both understandable and suspicious. Marcus had positioned himself as savior, while Patricia had been too devastated to question why her husband's commanding officer was quite so devoted to supporting the widow of a subordinate who had supposedly died in friendly fire during routine operations. "Mom, did you ever receive Dad's death benefits?" Diana asked, her question cutting to financial evidence that would prove whether Patricia had been unknowing victim or complicit in conspiracy. "Marcus handled all of that," Patricia replied, her voice carrying the resigned tone of 1970s widow who had been culturally conditioned to let men manage financial matters. "He said the benefits were complicated because of the friendly fire, that there was reduced payout because James had violated orders, but that he'd make sure we were taken care of regardless. The money Marcus gave us seemed generous at the time, enough to cover rent and groceries, and I was too grief-stricken to question whether it was the full amount we were entitled to." The explanation suggested Patricia had been victim rather than accomplice. Marcus had given her enough money to prevent suspicion while stealing the majority of death benefits that should have totaled $2.3 million, using Patricia's grief and 1970s gender dynamics to prevent questions about financial details that widows weren't expected to understand or manage. "Mom, I need you to try to remember something very specific," Diana said, recognizing that her next question could either confirm Marcus's guilt or reveal that Ray's accusations were based on misunderstanding rather than witnessed murder. "Did Marcus ever talk about the circumstances of how Daddy died? Did he ever mention Colonel Webb or operations involving civilians or anything about Daddy refusing orders?" Patricia's face transformed as memory surfaced, not the pleasant reminiscence of loving husband, but rather the disturbed recognition of something wrong that she had suppressed for decades, because acknowledging it would have meant confronting that she'd married her first husband's murderer. "There was one night," Patricia said slowly, her voice dropping to whisper as if Marcus might somehow hear across distance and time. "Maybe 6 months after we married, when Marcus had been drinking heavily and started crying. He said James had been stubborn, that James wouldn't listen to reason about mission parameters, that James had forced Marcus to make impossible choice between completing objectives and protecting someone who was threatening unit cohesion. I asked what he meant, and he got angry, said I wouldn't understand military decisions, that second-guessing commanders got soldiers killed. I never brought it up again because he scared me when he was angry." The confession suggested Patricia had sensed truth but had been too afraid or too financially dependent to pursue questions that could have exposed Marcus's crime. She had chosen survival and security for her daughter over justice for her murdered husband, creating complicity through silence even if she hadn't known the complete truth. Meanwhile, Diana was discovering that confronting Marcus about her father's murder would require sacrificing not just her relationship with the only father figure she'd known, but potentially the company itself. Lucas Johnson's legal analysis had revealed that if Sterling Financial's founding capital had been stolen from James Sterling's estate, then the company's ownership structure might be legally void, creating claims that could force liquidation or transfer of assets to James Sterling's rightful heir, while Marcus faced both criminal prosecution for murder and civil liability for financial fraud. "Ms. Sterling, if you pursue legal action against Marcus Webb, you need to understand that you're potentially destroying Sterling Financial in the process," Lucas explained during their strategy meeting. "Defense attorneys will argue that company ownership is complicated by the fact that you've been CEO for 8 years and have personally benefited from the allegedly stolen capital through salary, bonuses, and equity appreciation. Courts might determine that unwinding 50-year-old corporate structure creates more harm than allowing you to retain control while paying restitution to your father's estate, which would effectively mean paying yourself from company assets." The legal complexity was both technically intricate and morally clear. Diana deserved justice for her father's murder and theft, even when that justice required sacrificing corporate empire that bore Sterling name but had been built on Sterling blood money stolen by the man who'd spilled it. "Mr. Johnson, I need to understand what pursuing this case will cost beyond just Sterling Financial," Diana said to Lucas, while his father Ray sat quietly, having already sacrificed 47 years to keeping promise that was finally being fulfilled. "What happens to my mother if Marcus is prosecuted? What happens to employees who depend on Sterling Financial for their livelihoods? What happens to me personally when the world discovers that my entire career has been built on my father's stolen death benefits?" "Ms. Sterling, pursuing justice means accepting that truth is more important than comfortable lies," Ray interjected, his voice carrying veterans' conviction about honor mattering more than consequences. "Your father died because he wouldn't compromise his principles, even when that integrity cost him his life. The question you need to answer is whether you're willing to honor his sacrifice by exposing the truth, even when that truth destroys everything Marcus Webb built on your father's corpse." Over the following weeks, as Diana processed that vindicating her father required destroying the stepfather who had raised her while potentially bankrupting the company that employed 3,000 people whose jobs depended on corporate stability, that prosecution and asset seizure would eliminate, she understood that some moral choices required accepting that doing right thing created casualties among people who bore no responsibility for original crimes, but whose livelihoods depended on structures built through systematic evil. "Dad, Marcus, we need to talk," Diana said during the confrontation she'd been avoiding for 3 weeks, using his name rather than paternal title for first time in 40 years as she prepared to destroy the family structure that had defined her entire life. At 76, Marcus Webb possessed the kind of entitled authority that characterized men who had built fortunes through crimes they'd committed so long ago that statute of limitations and institutional complicity made them feel immune to consequences. He'd murdered James Sterling 54 years ago, stolen his death benefits, married his widow, raised his daughter, and built empire using blood money while never facing accountability because military cover-ups and Cold War secrecy had protected war criminals whose crimes served geopolitical interests that made individual murders seem acceptable costs of anti-communist operations. Diana, whatever that janitor told you about Vietnam was the confused memories of traumatized veteran who spent 50 years processing combat through distorted lens, Marcus replied with smooth confidence that had convinced Patricia, Diana, and countless business partners that he was trustworthy authority figure rather than calculating murderer. Ray Johnson is sincere in his beliefs, but PTSD creates false memories that feel absolutely real to people who experience them. The lunchbox has my father's letter written in his own hand 40 minutes before he died, Diana said quietly, watching Marcus's confident facade begin cracking as he realized that physical evidence existed contradicting 5 decades of carefully maintained lies. The letter describes you shooting him after he refused to participate in civilian massacre and threatened to report your opium trafficking. The letter mentions $2.3 million in death benefits that should have been paid to my mother, but which you stole to fund Sterling Financial. The letter warns me specifically not to trust you because you killed him to protect war crimes. Some sacrifices require confronting that the people who raised us might have murdered the people who created us, and that honoring our biological parents sometimes means destroying our functional parents, even when that destruction affects everyone whose stability depends on maintaining comfortable lies that protect murderers while erasing victims. 8 weeks after Diana had confronted Marcus with her father's letter, Attorney Lucas Johnson arrived at her temporary residence. She'd moved out of the Sterling family estate after Marcus had threatened legal action claiming that James Sterling's 47-year-old letter was forgery created by Ray as part of elaborate extortion scheme, carrying evidence that would either definitively prove Marcus's guilt or reveal that Ray's decades-long promise had been based on traumatic memories distorted by PTSD and time. Ms. Sterling, I've obtained declassified military records from 1971 that confirm key details from your father's letter and Ray's testimony, Lucas said, spreading documentation across the dining table in Diana's modest apartment that represented dramatic lifestyle change from executive mansion she'd abandoned when family home became unbearable, reminder of lies that had sustained it. The records show that on March 14, 1971, there was incident in village coordinates matching location that your father described, and there was investigation into civilian casualties that was closed under classified authority, citing national security concerns. At 43, Diana possessed the kind of exhausted determination that characterized people whose entire understanding of their origins had been shattered and reconstructed through painful process of accepting truths that comfortable lies had concealed. She'd lost her stepfather, damaged her relationship with her mother, jeopardized her company, and discovered that her career had been funded by her biological father's murder, but she'd gained something more valuable than comfortable ignorance. She'd gained truth about who James Sterling had been and why he'd died. "Do the records identify Marcus Webb as responsible for the incident?" Diana asked, recognizing that connecting Marcus to her father's death required evidence beyond Ray's eyewitness testimony that defense attorneys were characterizing as unreliable memories from traumatized veteran. The records identify Colonel Marcus Webb as commanding officer who filed after-action report claiming that Lieutenant James Sterling died during unauthorized patrol that resulted in friendly fire when Sterling failed to follow established protocols, Lucas replied, reading from declassified documents that had been sealed for national security reasons that were really about protecting military officers whose war crimes served broader strategic objectives. But there's additional documentation that wasn't included in official reports, field medic notes indicating that Sterling's fatal wound came from M16 rifle fired at close range from angle inconsistent with enemy engagement or accidental friendly fire during combat operations. The medical evidence was both technically specific and devastating. James Sterling had been shot execution style rather than during chaotic firefight, suggesting deliberate murder rather than tragic accident that Marcus's official reports had claimed. "Lucas, can we prove that Marcus personally shot my father?" Diana pressed, understanding that legal prosecution required connecting Marcus to trigger rather than just proving that official story was false. "We have Ray's eyewitness testimony, your father's contemporaneous letter naming Marcus as shooter, and medical evidence inconsistent with friendly fire during combat," Lucas replied, building prosecutorial case that combined multiple evidence sources. "But we also have something stronger. We have financial records showing that Marcus Webb received $2.3 million in April 1971 through channels that exactly match military death benefit payout structures, and that money was used to fund business ventures that became Sterling Financial. The financial forensics provided the kind of documentary evidence that juries found more compelling than eyewitness testimony from elderly veterans whose memories defense attorneys could attack as unreliable. Money trails created paper documentation that was harder to dispute than human recollection of traumatic events from 50 years ago. As their alliance strengthened through Lucas's legal expertise, Ray's unwavering testimony, and Diana's commitment to honoring her father despite personal costs, they were joined by unexpected ally, Patricia Sterling Webb, whose Alzheimer's had paradoxically freed her from fear of Marcus's retaliation by making her legally incompetent and thus unable to be held accountable for testimony that her husband would have previously prevented through intimidation or manipulation. "I want to testify against Marcus," Patricia announced during family meeting that Diana had arranged at assisted living facility. "My memory isn't reliable for recent events, but I remember 1971 clearly, and I remember things Marcus said when he thought I wasn't paying attention, or when he'd been drinking and his guard was down." At 70, Patricia possessed the kind of moral clarity that sometimes emerged when cognitive decline eliminated fear and social conditioning that had previously prevented honest testimony. She couldn't remember yesterday's lunch, but she could recall with crystalline precision the moments when Marcus had revealed truths about James's death that she'd been too afraid or too financially dependent to pursue, when full cognitive function would have made her legally responsible for that knowledge. "Mum, what specifically did Marcus say that could help prove he murdered Dad?" Diana asked, recognizing that her mother's testimony could either strengthen their case or be dismissed as confused rambling from Alzheimer's patient whose medical condition made her unreliable witness. "Marcus used to have nightmares," Patricia said, her voice carrying clarity that Alzheimer's sometimes allowed for distant memories. He'd wake up screaming about James, about having no choice, about orders and missions, and James being stubborn. One time he woke up and said, James wouldn't shut up about the civilians. I had to make him stop. I had to protect the operation. I asked what he meant, and he said he was just having bad dreams about combat decisions. But Diana, he was talking in his sleep about killing your father, and I was too afraid to acknowledge what I was hearing. The testimony was both powerful and potentially inadmissible. Defense attorneys would argue that Patricia's Alzheimer's made her memories unreliable, and that decades-old statements from Marcus during nightmares didn't constitute legal confession of murder, but the emotional weight of widow, testifying against the man who had replaced her murdered husband, created narrative that could influence juries, regardless of strict legal admissibility. Meanwhile, Ray Johnson was experiencing his own vindication as military veterans organizations began supporting investigation into systematic cover-ups of Vietnam war crimes, recognizing that Ray's 47-year quest to honor his promise represented thousands of similar stories about veterans whose testimony had been dismissed or buried to protect officers whose crimes served institutional interests that made individual atrocities seem acceptable costs of broader strategic objectives. Mr. Johnson, the Vietnam Veterans Against War Crimes organization, wants to support your testimony and Diana's prosecution of Marcus Webb, reported veteran advocate Margaret Chen during their consultation. Your case represents systematic pattern where military leadership buried investigations into officer misconduct to maintain unit cohesion and avoid public relations disasters that could undermine support for war effort. At 68, Ray possessed the kind of exhausted relief that characterized people whose life's mission was finally being validated after decades of being dismissed as delusional veteran whose traumatic memories couldn't be trusted. He'd spent 47 years being told that his testimony was unreliable, that his accusations were impossible to prove, that his promise to James was noble but futile, and now military records and financial forensics were confirming everything he'd been saying. Since 1971, Ms. Chen, I don't need organizational support to testify. I made a promise to my best friend 54 years ago, and I'm going to keep that promise regardless of whether anyone believes me, Ray replied with conviction that transcended institutional validation. But I appreciate that other veterans understand that some promises transcend bureaucratic convenience, and that honor means maintaining commitments even when keeping them costs everything else. Udatan. Over the following months, as Lucas built comprehensive prosecution case combining Ray's testimony, James's letter, Patricia's corroboration, medical evidence and financial forensics, the alliance expanded to include investigative journalists, military historians, and government accountability advocates whose collective expertise transformed Diana's personal quest for justice into broader examination of how Cold War priorities had protected war criminals whose atrocities served anti-communist objectives that made individual murders seem strategically acceptable. What we're exposing, Lucas announced during press conference that made Diana's case into national news story, is not just one man's murder of his subordinate to cover up war crimes, but systematic pattern where military and government institutions protected officers like Marcus Webb because prosecuting them would have revealed that American operations in Vietnam sometimes involved exactly the kind of civilian massacres and drug trafficking that we were claiming to be fighting against. Some alliances require understanding that personal quests for justice can become catalysts for systematic accountability when individual cases reveal institutional failures that protected countless perpetrators, and that honoring promises to dead friends sometimes requires transforming private grief into public reckoning that forces acknowledgement of truths that comfortable narratives preferred to bury. The trial that would determine whether Marcus Webb faced murder charges for killing James Sterling 54 years ago reached its climax when Marcus's defense team filed motion to dismiss based on statute of limitations, arguing that military murders committed during wartime operations in 1971 couldn't be prosecuted in civilian court in 2025 because combat-related homicides fell under military jurisdiction that had closed the case decades ago through official investigation that found no criminal wrongdoing. Your Honor, the defense argues that this court lacks jurisdiction over alleged military crimes that were investigated and closed by proper authorities 54 years ago, argued Marcus's attorney, Philip Hawthorne, during hearing that would determine whether the case could proceed or would be dismissed on procedural grounds. Colonel Webb was exonerated by military investigation in 1971, and double jeopardy prevents re-prosecution of alleged offenses that were already adjudicated through proper channels. The legal argument was both technically sophisticated and morally reprehensible. Marcus was using military cover-up that had protected him in 1971 to claim that same cover-up now prevented civilian prosecution for murder that had been deliberately concealed through falsified reports and destroyed evidence. Your Honor, the military investigation in 1971 was deliberately corrupted by the defendant who used his command authority to falsify records and suppress witness testimony, countered Prosecutor Sarah Martinez, whose military law expertise had been crucial for navigating jurisdictional complexities. This wasn't legitimate adjudication. It was obstruction of justice that prevented proper investigation, which means double jeopardy protections don't apply because there was never legitimate prosecution of the actual crime. But Ms. Martinez, how can this court determine 54 years later whether 1971 military investigation was corrupted rather than simply reaching conclusion that defense finds inconvenient? Judge Rebecca Morrison asked, her question revealing the evidentiary challenges of prosecuting decades-old military crimes where documentation had been classified or destroyed. Your Honor, we have contemporaneous evidence that the defendant falsified reports, Martinez replied, presenting James Sterling's letter as exhibit that predated official investigation and documented Marcus Webb's crime before cover-up could be implemented. Lieutenant Sterling wrote this letter on March 14, 1971, the day of his death, explicitly naming Colonel Webb as his murderer and describing the war crimes that motivated the killing. This letter was written before any official investigation began, which means it represents uncontaminated testimony from the victim himself about circumstances of his murder. Adi. The evidentiary value of James's letter was both unprecedented and legally complex. Defense attorneys argued that letter written by dying soldier couldn't be authenticated after 54 years and might have been forged by Ray Johnson as part of elaborate scheme, while prosecutors argued that paper analysis, handwriting verification, and historical context proved letter's authenticity beyond reasonable doubt. Your Honor, even if we accept the letter as authentic, it represents dying man's subjective interpretation of chaotic combat situation rather than objective evidence of criminal intent, Hawthorne continued, using defense strategy that characterized James's testimony as unreliable perception rather than factual documentation. Lieutenant Sterling may have genuinely believed that Colonel Webb shot him deliberately, but belief doesn't establish criminal liability when combat situations create confusion about who fired which shots during firefights involving multiple personnel and enemy combatants. The argument revealed how defense attorneys planned to characterize James's murder as tragic accident during combat chaos rather than deliberate execution that medical evidence and financial records proved had been premeditated crime rather than battlefield confusion. Meanwhile, Diana Sterling was experiencing her own crisis as Sterling Financial's board of directors had voted to remove her as CEO, citing personal conflicts creating reputational damage and institutional instability, effectively punishing her for exposing that company's founding capital had been stolen from her murdered father by the man who had built corporate empire on blood money. Ms. Sterling, the board recognizes your personal investment in pursuing justice for your father, but continuing this prosecution threatens Sterling Financial's corporate reputation and market valuation, Board Chairman Gerald Foster explained during termination meeting. Shareholders are concerned that revelations about company's origins will create legal liability and consumer backlash that could bankrupt the firm and eliminate jobs for 3,000 employees whose livelihoods depend on maintaining corporate stability. The corporate pressure was both financially motivated and morally bankrupt. Board members who had benefited from Marcus's stolen fortune for decades were now protecting their interests by sacrificing Diana's leadership while characterizing her pursuit of justice as selfish vendetta that prioritized personal grievance over institutional welfare. Mr. Foster, Sterling Financial exists because Marcus Webb murdered my father and stole $3 million in death benefits that should have supported my mother and me, Diana replied, her voice carrying controlled fury about being punished for exposing crimes that had enriched everyone now condemning her. Every dividend you've received, every stock option you've exercised, every bonus you've collected has been funded by my father's stolen blood money. I'm not destroying this company. I'm exposing that it was built on murder and theft. But Ms. Sterling, pursuing that exposure punishes current employees who bear no responsibility for alleged crimes from 50 years ago, Foster countered, using institutional logic that treated present stability as more important than historical justice. Your father's death was tragic, but destroying 3,000 jobs to vindicate 54-year-old murder doesn't honor his memory. It just creates new victims. Undil. As Diana faced termination for pursuing truth while Marcus's defense team worked to dismiss charges based on military jurisdiction and statute of limitations, Ray Johnson was confronting his own crisis when defense attorneys obtained his complete military and medical records documenting 47 years of PTSD treatment, depression, and one suicide attempt in 1985 that they would use to argue his testimony was unreliable product of traumatized mind that had distorted combat memories into elaborate conspiracy theory. Mr. Johnson, isn't it true that you've been diagnosed with severe PTSD and have been hospitalized multiple times for psychiatric treatment related to combat trauma? Hawthorne asked during pre-trial deposition designed to undermine Ray's credibility. Yes, I have PTSD from Vietnam, and I attempted suicide in 1985 when I couldn't find Diana and thought I'd failed my promise to James, Ray replied with honest acknowledgement of mental health struggles that he refused to deny or minimize. But my PTSD doesn't change what I witnessed on March 14, 1971, when Colonel Webb shot Lieutenant James Sterling in the chest from 3 feet away after James refused to participate in civilian massacre. But, Mr. Johnson, how can you be certain after 54 years that your memories haven't been altered by decades of psychiatric treatment and trauma processing? Hawthorne pressed, using defense strategy that characterized Ray's testimony as unreliable despite his unwavering consistency over decades. Because I've been carrying James Sterling's letter for 54 years, and everything in that letter matches what I witnessed, Ray replied, his voice carrying conviction that transcended technical challenges to memory reliability. James wrote that letter while bleeding to death in my arms, and every word in it describes exactly what happened and why. My PTSD doesn't change that physical evidence or financial records showing that Marcus Webb received $3 million in April 1971 and used it to build the company that Diana was running until her board fired her for pursuing truth. As legal proceedings reached critical phase, where judge would determine whether case could proceed or be dismissed on jurisdictional and statute of limitations grounds, Diana made decision that would either strengthen prosecution or destroy her remaining credibility. She announced that she was donating her entire personal fortune, valued at $47 million, to fund legal defense for Ray Johnson and to create foundations supporting families of military personnel whose deaths had been covered up to protect officers who committed war crimes. "I'm not pursuing this case for money, I'm pursuing it for truth," Diana announced during press conference that transformed her from corporate CEO into justice advocate. "Marcus Webb stole my father's death benefits and used them to build Sterling Financial, and the board that just fired me is protecting their dividends by punishing me for exposing murder that funded their wealth. I don't need their money. I need them to admit that my father was murdered and that his killer has been living free for 54 years, while the man who tried to honor his promise has been dismissed as delusional veteran whose testimony doesn't matter." The dramatic sacrifice of her fortune represented both tactical legal strategy, demonstrating that financial motivation wasn't driving prosecution, and moral statement that truth mattered more than wealth that had been built on father's corpse. Some confrontations with institutional evil require accepting that pursuing justice often punishes victims while protecting perpetrators, and that exposing decades-old crimes requires sacrificing present stability when institutions prefer comfortable lies over uncomfortable truths that could force accountability for systematic corruption. 31 months after Judge Morrison had ruled that Marcus Webb could be prosecuted in civilian court for James Sterling's murder despite military jurisdiction arguments, and 18 months after jury had convicted 78-year-old Marcus of first-degree murder committed during commission of war crimes, Diana Sterling stood at Arlington National Cemetery watching military honor guard into her father's remains, finally recovered from Vietnam and returned for burial with full honors. After 56 years of lying in jungle grave marked only by Ray Johnson's memory and promise. The funeral was attended by over 300 Vietnam veterans, whose presence represented collective acknowledgement that James Sterling's death had been vindication rather than tragedy. He had died refusing to participate in war crimes, and his murder had ultimately exposed systematic military corruption that had protected countless officers whose atrocities had been concealed under classification of national security and Cold War necessity. Lieutenant James Robert Sterling died on March 14, 1971, refusing orders to participate in civilian massacre, read retired General Patricia Chen during eulogy that honored James's sacrifice while acknowledging institutional failures that had concealed his murder for 56 years. His death was initially classified as friendly fire during routine operations, but we now know that he was murdered by his commanding officer to silence testimony about war crimes, including drug trafficking and civilian atrocities. Lieutenant Sterling's daughter Diana and his best friend Raymond Johnson have spent years pursuing truth that military systems tried to bury. Today, we honor not just Lieutenant Sterling's sacrifice, but the promise that Ray Johnson kept for 56 years, and Diana Sterling's courage in pursuing justice, even when that pursuit cost her corporate career and personal fortune. At 70, Ray Johnson possessed the kind of exhausted peace that characterized veterans whose life missions had finally been completed. He had kept his promise to James Sterling, delivered the letter to Diana, testified at Marcus's trial despite defense attacks on his credibility, and lived to see his best friend honored rather than forgotten by military that had initially covered up his murder. "James, I kept my promise," Ray whispered at the graveside, tears streaming down his weathered face as he finally released burden he'd carried for 56 years. "I found Diana. I told her you loved her. I made sure Webb faced justice. You can rest now, brother. Your daughter knows who you were and what you died for. At 45, Diana possessed hard-earned wisdom about identity and purpose that came from discovering her origins had been built on lies, but choosing to honor truth regardless of cost. She had lost sterling financial, sacrificed her fortune, destroyed her relationship with Marcus, complicated her relationship with her mother, but she had gained something more valuable. She understood who her father had been and why his death had mattered beyond just personal loss. Dad, James, I never got to know you, but Mr. Johnson carried your love to me across 56 years, Diana said during her own tribute at graveside. Your letter taught me that honor matters more than convenience, that truth matters more than comfort, and that some promises are worth keeping even when keeping them costs everything else. Mr. Johnson taught me what loyalty looks like when it's tested by decades of being dismissed, ignored, and told that your mission doesn't matter. Between your letter and his promise, you both taught me more about fatherhood than Marcus ever did during 40 years of lies. The military had awarded James Sterling the Distinguished Service Cross posthumously, not just for his combat service, but specifically for his refusal to participate in war crimes, even when that refusal cost his life, making his death into moral victory rather than just tactical loss. Meanwhile, Marcus Webb was serving life sentence without parole in federal prison at 78, having been convicted not only of James's murder, but also of theft of military death benefits, fraud, and obstruction of justice for falsifying reports and suppressing investigation. His appeals had been exhausted, and his health was failing in ways that suggested he wouldn't live long enough to complete his sentence. 56 years of living on stolen fortune and murdered friends' reputation had ended in prison cell, where his war crimes and subsequent cover-up had finally caught up with him. Patricia Sterling Webb had divorced Marcus immediately after his conviction, reclaiming her first husband's name and spending her remaining lucid moments processing that she had married her first husband's murderer and allowed him to raise her daughter while erasing James's memory. Her Alzheimer's had progressed to a point where she no longer remembered Marcus or the trial, but she occasionally had moments of clarity where she remembered James with love that 56 years hadn't diminished. Diana, your father made me promise I'd make sure you knew he loved you, Patricia said during one of her lucid moments at assisted living facility. I failed that promise by marrying Marcus and letting him erase James from our lives. I'm sorry I was too weak to pursue truth when Marcus's nightmares were telling me what he'd done. I'm sorry you had to learn about your real father from a janitor carrying a lunchbox, instead of from me telling you stories about the man I loved before grief and fear made me accept comfort from his murderer. The apology represented Patricia's acceptance of her own complicity through silence, acknowledging that victims sometimes become enablers when survival requires ignoring truths that would force impossible choices. 3 years after Ray had opened the lunchbox and changed Diana's life forever, he stood in the community center that bore James Sterling's name, funded by Diana's donated fortune and dedicated to supporting families of military personnel whose deaths had been covered up or mischaracterized by command structures that prioritized institutional protection over family welfare and truth. Mr. Johnson, the James Sterling Memorial Foundation, has now helped recover remains and expose cover-ups for 47 military families whose loved ones died under suspicious circumstances during Vietnam, reported Foundation Director Lucas Johnson. Ray's son, whose legal expertise had been crucial for Marcus's prosecution and whose career had been transformed from corporate law to military justice advocacy. Your promise to my friend James has created systematic change that prevents other families from spending 56 years not knowing how their loved ones really died. At 70, Ray possessed integrated identity that characterized people whose personal missions had transcended individual vindication to create broader social impact. He'd kept promise to one friend, and in doing so had created pathways for hundreds of other families to learn truths that military bureaucracy had concealed for decades. James Sterling's letter taught me that some promises transcend death, time, and institutional resistance, Ray said during foundation ceremony commemorating James's sacrifice. For 56 years, I carried that lunchbox knowing that Diana deserved to know her father loved her and died honorably. The letter itself was precious, but what mattered more was the principle that truth matters enough to pursue even when pursuit costs everything else. James died for that principle. Diana sacrificed her career and fortune for that principle. And every family we help recover truth about their loved ones validates that principle matters more than institutional convenience. Diana stood beside Ray during ceremony, their unlikely partnership representing the kind of family that formed through shared commitment to honor rather than through blood relation. Ray had been stranger carrying her father's lunchbox, but through his 56-year promise, he had become the father figure she never had, teaching her through example what loyalty and honor looked like when tested by decades of being dismissed as delusional. "Mr. Johnson, you gave me my father back," Diana said during ceremony. "Not the living father I never got to know, but the memory of who he was and why his death mattered. You taught me that the people who raise us aren't always the ones who deserve that role, and that sometimes the people who carry lunchboxes and clean offices possess more honor than the people who sit in corner offices built on stolen fortunes. You kept a promise for 56 years. That's more than most people accomplish in lifetime, and it taught me that promises to dead friends matter as much as obligations to living ones. Some families are created not through blood or marriage, but through shared commitment to honoring people who died before their promises could be kept. And the most meaningful legacy often comes from maintaining faith with dead friends, whose final words create obligations that transcend death, time, and every obstacle that institutions place in path of truth, that challenges comfortable lies built on systematic evil and protected through decades of cover-up and denial. If this story moved you, if you felt the weight of that lunchbox carried for 56 years, if you understood what it means to keep a promise when everyone tells you to let it go, subscribe to this channel right now. Hit that like button if Ray's loyalty to his fallen friend made you believe in honor again. But most importantly, I need to hear from you in the comments. What did you think of this story? Have you ever kept a promise that cost you everything? Do you have family members who served in Vietnam and whose stories might not be completely true? Have you ever discovered that someone you trusted built their success on someone else's tragedy? And here's the question that matters. If you were Ray, would you have spent 56 years carrying that lunchbox? Or would you have given up after the first decade when nobody believed you and the military buried the investigation? According to the Department of Defense, there are still over 1,500 American service members from the Vietnam War whose remains have not been recovered or whose deaths have not been fully explained. Ray and James's story is fiction, but the systematic cover-ups of military misconduct during Vietnam were terrifyingly real, and thousands of families never learned the truth about how their loved ones died. If you know a Vietnam veteran, thank them. If you suspect that a family member's military death wasn't accurately reported, the James Sterling Memorial Foundation is fictional, but organizations like the Vietnam Veterans of America can help families seek truth about suspicious military deaths. Share this video with anyone who needs to understand that some promises transcend death, that honor means keeping your word even when it costs 56 years of your life, and that the people carrying lunchboxes sometimes possess more integrity than the people commanding armies. Subscribe, like, comment, share. And if you've ever made a promise to someone who died, keep it, even if it takes 56 years. Even if nobody believes you, even if keeping it costs everything else. Because Ray Johnson proved that some promises matter more than comfort, convenience, or institutional approval. Thank you for watching. I'll see you in the next story.